We are now going to proceed to our first panel session, which is a featured conversation on connectivity after COVID-19. During this session, speakers from the Trade and Development Bank and the City of Cape Town will discuss key issues surrounding connectivity on the continent in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm delighted to introduce you to our moderator for this session, Barbara Keating, the president of Computer Frontiers, as well as a board member of the Corporate Council on Africa. If you are viewing from the opening session, to view this next session, please click on the Join button on the agenda to the right of your screen. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you all in this next session.
Thank you for your introduction, Daniel. Welcome everyone, whatever time of day it is, wherever you are, and hopefully you're warm. So we are very pleased this morning to have a chat with two esteemed African colleagues who will give us two different slants on connectivity after COVID from a technical and a financial perspective. We will have a short discussion amongst us first, and then we'll turn to the audience for questions. So please, if you have questions already, please start asking away. My colleagues' bios are on the platform, but I'll just briefly introduce them. Mr. Admasu Tadesse is the president and chief executive officer for the Trade and Development Bank. And this was formerly the trading as the PTA Bank. Prior to being with the TDA Bank, he was the executive vice president at the Development Bank of Southern Africa in Johannesburg. And prior to that, he worked as an advisor, an analyst, and specialist with various international funds and organizations in New York. Just a side note, we met 10 years ago at a meeting such as this. And he was just getting a lot of his funds together. And I am so amazed and impressed at what he has done in the last 10 years. And I cannot wait to see what he does with the next 10 years. So the challenge is with you. We also have with us Omeshni Naidu, and she's the Director of Information Systems for the City of Cape Town in South Africa. Mesh is currently the director, and prior to this appointment, she was head of the shared services for Southern Africa, Diageo, and prior to that, a management consultant for Accenture. If I might summarize a bit for you, Mesh, you're a digital transformation expert and crisis management, in both crisis management and doing that during digital transformations, which is quite amazing. By way of background, you came into the Cape Town government in 2017 during the zero-day water crisis. That was around the severe drought, as all of us watched from around the world what South Africa was going to do and what Cape Town was going to do to manage that crisis. So we are very interested to see what happened with that and how you applied that to 3 years later, now the COVID crisis, where you've had to establish work-at-home strategies for 18,000 staff in the face of COVID, which is quite an accomplishment. And all during this, you're managing an implementation of the broadband fiber optic rollout worth approximately $100 million in Cape Town. So those are just amazing, amazing accomplishments. So now I'm just going to get started and talk a little bit to set the tone of the conversation, which is really the pandemic and what it has done and where we're going. So over the past 18 months, the crisis management in response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been the overwhelming focus for both the public and the private sector, for us in the US and across Africa. Although the pandemic has not yet ended, attention is beginning to turn towards rebuilding and growth. The economic recession triggered by COVID pandemic is hitting African countries very hard, as we all know, as well as our own. Most of them are facing their first recession in 25 years. By contrast, when the global financial crisis hit the continent in 2009, only 11 countries went into recession. So it is truly COVID driven. For all of its tragedy that we've had with the pandemic, it has unlocked really incredible resources and political will in both Africa and the US to strengthen African economies. And it's become clear through the pandemic that strengthening the digital landscape in Africa can reverberate throughout the entire economies. African economies were undergoing a steady process of digitization prior to the pandemic. And we were talking about this. This isn't something new that occurred just because of the pandemic. It's been going on for 10, 20 years, really. And what are some of the big things that have happened? The mobile money revolution with 300 million accounts, the highest number in the world. Johannesburg, Cape Town, Nairobi, Lagos are ranked among the top 100 cities for fintech ecosystems worldwide. In 2018, financing for digital infrastructure was $7 billion from the US, not from the US, from private investors. 80% came from private investors. And the projects are continuing and are very robust. But the World Bank has estimated that it's $100 billion investment is needed in the next decade. So mobile and cellular subscriptions have also doubled in the decade prior to 2018, and 88 per 100 people in Africa have a cell phone. So there's good news. There's a starting point to work from, and more work that needs to be done on digitizing sectors of the economy, like agriculture, health, public services, to open up more access to those not directly employed in the tech world, and especially those 70% of the youth who live in rural areas. And one of the biggest questions is how we'll finance these projects and how we'll get them done. So my question for you, Mesh, I'm going to turn to you and ask you about, from your perspective in handling two major crises in the past 3 years and being the digitizing expert that you are, how did you employ ICT in the government of Cape Town's response?
Thanks for that, Barbara, and thanks for the introductions. I think many leaders in Africa can talk about crisis management, to be honest with you, but happy to talk about it from a Cape Town perspective. When I joined the city, 2 months later, we hit the drought, which was completely actually not expected at that point in time. And I think what we saw in terms of the water crisis in the 2018 period when Cape Town experienced it was that, it really came down with the rallying everyone together to try to make sure that we didn't become the first city in the world that had no water. And to be honest with you, sitting on the crisis committee and forming part of the executive teams and working with them on such a crisis, I can tell you that if we really had hit the dreaded day zero, it would have been quite a disaster for us. So during that time frame, really what took place during that space was this bringing together of data, people, and digital is what we saw coming together quite nicely during the crisis. And I'll tell you a little story of what I believe is one of the true successes coming out of the water crisis and what really drove some great outcomes for us to not really hit that dreaded day zero. And I'll talk about it very much in terms of showcasing the use of the technologies that was available to us at that point in time. And so from a data perspective, I think during the water crisis, there was all of these questions around, what is it that we could do in a very short space of time to try to help the citizens of Cape Town to ensure that we didn't hit the day zero pandemic. There was, at that point in time, lots of projects going, and that was on the go to try to increase water provisions into the city. But I think we were very clear at the leadership level that there was no way that water provisions was going to come fast enough, and that there was this short-term need for water consumption that needed to be significantly lowered. So if you think about, a citizen base of over 4 million people, that was quite an ask of a turnaround in terms of asking for behavioral change from our citizens to lower their water usage. I think that our citizens really understood, to be honest with you, that they needed to do something. But to change that water behavior was quite a tough ask. And so what we did as the City of Cape Town is we worked on a digital solution where we used very basic data in terms of having really well articulated data in our billing information on our ERP system. And we matched that and just put that in a very easy way onto a spatial map. So this billing data information was surfaced, and it was surfaced on our city website in the form of a map in a very, very simplified way through a RAG status to be able to just really show our citizens what their water consumption usage looked like at a household level. And what they also could see was not just their own household data, but the household data across the city. And it was amazing in terms of that data that we had put onto the city site. And within 2 to 4 weeks, we saw water usage reduced significantly. Actually, as the city, we almost halved water consumption and got within the restricted amounts. So when we delved quite deeper into that, what we found was that, just the simple usage of that technology allowed our citizens to see each other's consumption rates. And just because they could see each other's consumption rates, they were very quickly on that space of not wanting to be the one on the map with the red status. And they just immediately put more effort to reduce their consumption. And to be honest with you, it's this reduced lower consumption that really saved us from hitting a day zero.
Wow.
So I think that when we talk about, the options for ICT into Africa or into our sectors, I think this is an example of how through crisis management, just the usage of technology really worked for us. And that word of mouth then created and brought the people element into it. So that was, I think, on the water side, in terms of some of the things that we did in order to avert day zero. I think across the world, we have a great story to tell in terms of the water crisis and what we've learned off that. I think bringing that back into the pandemic crisis and where we are at from a pandemic crisis point of view, I think as Cape Town and as South Africa as a whole, we really just saw ourselves like the global trend moving into that remote working space. With lockdowns having hit us just like other countries and trying to ensure safety for all of our people, we just saw that remote working was something that had to be done. But I think what we really did see, though, was that, for those organizations, and I think the city was quite blessed in that it was one of those organizations that was sufficiently digitally connected that it was able to actually embrace that technology capabilities to enable it to be able to remote work. And as you said earlier on, we were able to take over 18,000 employees, which is just over half our staff complement, and we're able to remote work and ensure service delivery to our citizens. But with that said, I think if we had to speak to the citizens of Cape Town, and I don't doubt this is a lot probably into Africa, there were definitely challenges that were faced in the lockdown space. And I think a lot of those challenges, I think we heard the minister speak to it earlier on, was due to the fact that, we saw that connectivity that whilst it existed, it just wasn't enough. So fiber to the home was there, but it just didn't play out sufficiently in terms of effective connectivity. And I think we saw that a lot of homes therefore really struggled in our people to be able to not just remote work effectively, but also and most especially in the spaces of education and health. And so I think that as we've come out of this crisis, the need for connectivity has just come out as an even bigger need and a bigger ask. So those are some of my thoughts, I think, in terms of, what we've seen coming out of the crisis, and some active positive views of technology enablement and where it has helped us, and also areas and spaces where we definitely still need to continue to grow.
Thank you, Mesh. That was very insightful. And how do you find, so one of the major things was behavior change, and that is what we're struggling with around the globe. And so I find that what you were able to do to avert a water crisis, were you able to see any of that during the pandemic then? And applying those same kinds of things, did you do any kind of mapping or anything with the pandemic in terms of where outbreaks are happening?
Yeah, so absolutely. So I think that, from a behavioral change perspective, when you think about remote working, I'll be honest, for government, that was a bit of a foreign concept for many government employees. And to hit a day where it was full lockdown and you were just not allowed out of your house, I think many employees across even the private sector had to just learn to go online. I think the Zooms and I think all the jokes came out about, learning how to unmute and mute yourself was something that just became part of natural life, such to a point where I think in today's day and world, I call it a crisis if any of these virtual platform tools go offline, in terms of us just being able to collaborate and connect with each other. So I definitely think that, from that perspective, we saw behavioral changes in terms of people adapting to virtual platforms, getting used to what that means, and getting comfortable in that space and learning to just change in that way. I think what we also saw, and I think there's been some interesting conversations. I think the education sector in South Africa really took a knock over this time frame of kids really just needing accessibility. But I think what we also saw is the true resilience that comes about, and there's an ingenuity and creativity that we see comes about in terms of trying to find solutions to that. And we saw in the education sector, as the minister spoke to earlier on, this coming together of private and public sector to bring together solutions that were zero rated from a data cost perspective to try to create more accessibility for students. We saw that children were coming together in homes to share devices with each other, to be able to find spaces to safely connect with each other. And so I think that, through that, what we saw was communities have really started to think about why they need connectivity and have started to really start to think about why the investment in that is more and more important. So definitely, I think, the COVID pandemic has brought those changes. And I think we're starting to see a lot of policy adaptation, both in the private and public sector now, around remote working and the thinking of that post the pandemic.
Excellent comments. And I really appreciate your thoughts, and hopefully it will give some things to the audience as well. So Admasio, I'd like to ask you, so you have been engaged in so many infrastructure projects across the continent. Can you tell us briefly about them and how you would envision that they would support the advancement of the ICT sector? And if you could give us some thoughts on how the financial sector can help in the recovery after the pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Good to be here, and greetings to everybody. TDB has, of course, been very active, as you've noted, Barbara, in the infrastructure space. That has been one of the largest subsectors that we have managed to support over the years. It may not be obvious to many of the viewers today of this workshop that the ICT sector actually has been the trailblazer in infrastructure for the past 2 decades. It's been the most attractive subsector of infrastructure to bank, and so TDB has been very active in that subsector. We've supported 12 projects across 7 countries. here in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Uganda, in Malawi, in Seychelles, and Mauritius. I mean, it's quite a diverse group of countries that we've managed to support ICT in. And it's been a great run. We've done very well, and those projects have been very profitable as well for their sponsors and their owners. Some of them are, of course, also public sector, but they've also done very well alongside the private sector. We put in over $260 million of long-term funding, and that's been channeled towards cable investment, basically rolling out cables across many countries, but also buying network equipment and bringing into operation various related services. So it's been a very buoyant subsector, and most banks will tell you that they actually have appetite for ICT. The first wave was of course mobile telephony, and there was an explosion, a revolution in that space. And then nowadays it's fiber optic cables. We saw the undersea cables coming up across the eastern seaboard and the western seaboard. And those now have been connected into the hinterland through terrestrial cables. And even last mile countries like Burundi, which only got connected a couple of years ago, now has connected all of their provinces to fiber. And that was one of my favorite projects. It was called the Burundi Backbone System Project. And it required a very innovative financial structure to make it work. It did take some heavy lifting, and we did some blending and some maneuvers and managed to make it happen. And today it's a very successful project. But across the board, it's been a great story. And now everybody's trying to replicate the ICT story to the energy space. Of course, the Power Africa initiative, as many friends in the US will know, is one of the major focus areas in infrastructure today. That is partly inspired by what has happened in ICT. But all said and done, I don't think I should give the impression that the ICT agenda is anywhere close to being fulfilled. Of course, there's still a lot that needs to be done. There are still gaps. There's still many hundreds of several hundred million Africans that need to be connected. And of course, there are going to be issues on the data side. One of the big issues from a public policy perspective is going to be access and cost of access, affordability. And that will require public policy interventions to ensure that we're able to get a healthy amount of competition coming in, but also cross-border services also to come through and enhance and streamline service provision. So there is quite a bit of public policy work that needs to be done. Financing, I think, is less of a challenge. I think what probably needs to be done is just, of course, supporting the various operators and the application of digital technologies now using the infrastructure that's been created. The ICT infrastructure is essentially the base for all of the digitization that needs to happen. And now there's quite a bit of work that needs to be a lot of work needs to be done around business modeling, service provision, and sort of applying all of this in various sectors. Agriculture, health and education has been mentioned. Of course, everybody knows that the financial sector itself has been a huge beneficiary of digitization. Everybody knows about the mobile money story, but perhaps less obvious has been the way some wholesale banks and investment banks like us have managed to use cutting-edge technologies, particularly blockchain, as a way of really cutting down the speed it takes to do transactions. So we've managed to use distributed ledger-based technology to cut by almost 90% the lead times required to do trade finance deals. I'm sure USTDA will be happy to hear it, because trade is all about efficiency and turnaround time. Trade is not like infrastructure. Trade is short-term transactions, and you need to be able to turn around deals quickly. And if you can use technology to sort of supplant the age-old techniques of moving heavy documentation around by courier, which suffers from lockdowns, right? When the whole world sort of came to a standstill, many people realized it's not easy to move documentation around, as simple as that. And so we were all forced to become a little bit more aggressive in terms of adopting available technologies. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot to be done on the digitization side. But yeah, maybe I'll just pause for a moment and pick up on your new prompt.
Okay, thank you. Mesh, do you have any comments on what he said and where you think financing can work and jointly work with governments? How do we get this all together to get these agendas going?
Yeah, so I completely agree in terms of, probably the state of where we're at this point in time, in terms of, financing opportunities do exist, but it's how do you bring it together to solve the right problems, and how do you make determinations around ensuring that you can build effective programs that's really solving the problem. And I think very importantly, not just applying digital changes just for the sake of keeping up with technologies, but applying it for the right outcomes. So absolutely in agreement that there's still lots to do whilst there has been lots done, and figuring out the processes and bringing together and determining the best ways to bring those programs together is something important that should be thought through.
Thank you. I would like to know from both of you before we wrap up. We aren't going to take any questions at this point, and so I would like to know from both of you, what do you think? What would you like to say to your American colleagues about coming to do business in Africa, and how would you like to see us come into your countries?
Well, if I can defer to the madame, as they say, ladies first. Ameshni, you want to maybe kick off, or if you give me the prompt, I'll do so.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So, I think to our US colleagues, I think, really understanding what our challenges are is probably what's important. I think that coming in and thinking globally is great because you've kind of have some great global solutions, but understanding how we apply that locally to meet our local needs is something that I think is critical and a key success factor when looking to bring programs and commercial viability type programs into the countries of Africa. So I think, that's probably one of my key call outs when engaging with local African leaders in this space. Okay, happy to hand over.
Well, thank you, Barbara, for that question as well. I think, the one thing that as a banker I've noticed is perceptions are so important, right? Because especially for an international investor coming in as far away as the US, of course, you obviously have big gaps in understanding, in knowledge and so on, and that's a given, right? And the question is, how do you bridge those gaps? And my very strong recommendation is building on what Ameshni has just said, to understand the challenges, but to also understand the opportunities, and to actually understand the objective reality on the ground. People should come. I think, if you're going to make investments in millions, and in some cases more, surely just jumping on a plane and coming and spending a week or two just talking to prospective partners, to regulators, and to other investors who've been around, and to even African businesses who are here doing business already. I think those would give a lot of insights to prospective, investors or collaborators who want to do business here. I spent a lot of time in the US, in my educational years, my earlier years. And I know the US is a very open-minded place. And so people really pay a lot of attention to media reports. But unfortunately, the world of media tends to be very focused on the negative, I'm sorry to say. And they just love these nasty stories. You take one or two things, blow it up, and that becomes the whole story on a particular African country. Of course, I understand it's the nature of news. News is needs to be a little bit attractive, and people like headlines that are catchy and like to hear stories. But unfortunately, that from a business perspective puts American investors at a disadvantage, because if you look at other parts of the world that have been investing very heavily in Africa, they don't get confused by this type of media reporting, and you don't even see the media in those other parts of the world putting Africa in such a bad light often. And so I think I was just on a conference call the other day, and a Nigerian person who works actually for a major American bank was just saying how odd it is for him to answer all these questions about Nigeria, because people think Nigeria is falling apart because of what Boko Haram is doing and so on. Of course, it's nasty, it's ugly. But I think that puts a slant on perspectives, unfortunately, and I think that would be the one thing that's, because the rest follows, right? Because it's all about engagement and interaction. And when you come on the ground and you stay in a decent hotel, you find that there is actually electricity, there are mobile phones, you can transact, you can do a lot of business, and it's not these very sensationalist images that are always put out there, right? So I mean, I say this because I've been in the US for many years, and I know that it tends to occupy people's minds because of the way Africa's been portrayed over the decades. We call it Afro-pessimism, right? The way this is projected. But I think the diaspora, the US has a huge African diaspora, and I think that diaspora is very well placed to be a bridge for US investment and engagement in Africa, because they understand Africa, of course, a lot more deeply, and they can be excellent partners for bigger US investors to come into Africa. And that is an advantage that the US has that not many parts of the world has. So I would say get closer, engage, and sort of expand your sources of information, and don't just dwell on one or two news sites.
Thank you both. That was very excellent insight, and I agree with you. When I first started traveling into Africa, people would ask me, "Where do you sleep?" And I was like, 5-star hotels. I don't know what they were thinking. And so it's come a long way since then, but we still have an information gap that we really need to get through. And so hopefully with more and more of our connectivity, Africa and the US will become closer, and there's so much more we can do together. And so I think that's really what we're looking forward to. So with that, I'm going to have to wrap up. Anyone in the audience, you can find them on the platform and ask them questions directly. And I hope that you seek that out. So I just am thanking you both for an excellent presentation. We never have enough time. So what I would like to also now say to the audience is that we have two very timely panels that are coming up right after this discussion. One is innovative solutions and affordable financing to bridge the digital divide. And the other is frameworks to support a secure digital landscape. And so please don't miss these discussions. They're going to start in about a minute. They're relevant to both public and private sector organizations. And we're looking to deliver services and to the underserved and keep all digital assets secure. So please return to your agenda section, and on the platform, choose which of the concurrent sessions you'd like to do. Thank you again so much, and I appreciate your time. It was a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks all.